June 12, 1942. The Pinsk Marshes, Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. The marsh doesn't sleep, it waits. And tonight, in the blackness between stars and water, Dmitry Sokolov had taught it how to hunt. He crouched waist-deep in freezing water, his body submerged in the primordial soup of decaying reeds and suffocating mud. The cold had stopped registering an hour ago, replaced by a dull numbness that crept from his extremities toward his core. His breath came in shallow, measured draws, each exhale carefully controlled to avoid creating visible vapor in the night air. Around him the marsh pulsed with life. Frogs croaked in rhythmic chorus. Reeds whispered secrets to the wind. Somewhere distant, a nightbird called out, its cry swallowed almost immediately by the vast wetland that stretched for hundreds of square kilometers in every direction. 400 meters ahead, barely visible through the suffocating darkness, a faint amber glow flickered against the mist. A lantern. German patrol moving slowly through terrain they didn't understand, using light to navigate safely through channels and sinkholes that had claimed vehicles. Horses and men since the invasion began. Dmitry's hands, wrapped in strips of cloth to prevent the metal from adhering to frozen skin, made minute adjustments to the device mounted atop his Mosin-Nagant rifle. The modification looked crude, almost absurd. Layers of salvaged glass, carefully ground and polished, stacked in a brass housing that had once been part of a Luftwaffe instrument panel. Wires connected to a small battery pack, themselves scavenged from a downed Ju-87 Stuka he'd found half-submerged in the marsh 3 weeks prior. The entire contraption violated every regulation in the partisan field manual, assuming such a manual even existed. Through the modified scope, the distant lantern wasn't just a point of light. It was a beacon, a targeting solution. The layered polarized filters and reflective coatings amplified the flame's signature, turning it into a brilliant star against the absolute darkness of the marsh. More importantly, the thermal variance created by the lantern-bearer's body heat created a ghostly silhouette, barely perceptible but unmistakably human. Dmitry could see what no one else could. And tonight, that made all the difference between life and death for the 73 partisan fighters sleeping in concealed dugouts 2 kilometers behind him. He adjusted his position slightly, feeling the mud shift beneath his boots. The Germans were moving with confidence now, their lanterns swinging in a steady rhythm. They had no idea they were being watched, no idea that their tool of navigation had become their death sentence. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Nothing about this war was Minsk, 1936, before the world caught fire. Dmitry Sokolov was born into a world of light and glass. His father, Viktor Sokolov, operated a small optical workshop on Nemiga Street, 3 blocks from the city center. The shop was modest, cluttered with lenses and prisms that caught the afternoon sun and scattered rainbows across yellowed walls. The smell was distinctive: metal polish, wood shavings, and the faint chemical tang of etching solution. Victor had learned his trade in the old empire. Before revolutions and wars redrew maps and renamed cities, he was a craftsman in an age increasingly hostile to craftsmanship, a man who believed that precision and patience could solve any problem. Light bends for those who understand it, he would tell young Dmitry, holding a simple lens up to demonstrate how rays converged and diverged according to predictable laws. It follows rules. Master the rules and you master the light. Dmitry spent his childhood in that workshop, learning to grind lenses by hand, to test focal lengths, to identify the subtle imperfections that separated functional optics from true clarity. By age 12, he could diagnose a vision problem simply by watching how someone tilted their head while reading. By 15, he was constructing custom eyeglasses that drew clients from across the city. His father taught him that seeing wasn't passive. Vision was active, intentional. The human eye was merely the instrument. Understanding required interpretation, pattern recognition, the ability to distinguish signal from noise. It was a skill that would prove useful in ways Victor never imagined. The workshop prospered modestly through the 1930s, serving doctors and scholars, watchmakers and clerks. Victor never spoke of politics, never expressed opinions about the great transformations sweeping through Soviet society. He simply ground lenses and repaired spectacles, maintaining the careful neutrality of a man who had survived one revolution and hoped to survive whatever came next. But neutrality was a luxury that wouldn't last. In 1939, when Soviet forces occupied eastern Poland, refugees began flooding into Minsk. Some carried stories of German efficiency in the West. Others whispered about disappeared neighbors and midnight arrests. Victor listened to everything and said nothing. But Dmitri noticed his father working longer hours, as if craftsmanship could hold back the approaching darkness. In June 1941, the darkness arrived with 3 million men, 3,000 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft. Operation Barbarossa transformed Belorussia into a killing field within days. The Wehrmacht swept through Soviet defenses with terrifying speed, encircling entire armies, capturing cities before defenders could organize resistance. Minsk fell on June 28th, after barely a week of fighting. Viktor Sokolov was arrested on July 3, 1941. The charge, if there was one, was never explained. Perhaps someone had denounced him as a communist sympathizer. Perhaps the Germans simply needed skilled opticians for military purposes and resented his refusal to cooperate. Perhaps it was random, one of 10,000 arbitrary cruelties that defined occupation. Dmitri never saw his father again. For 3 months, Dmitri survived in the occupied city, watching the systematic destruction of everything familiar. The Germans established ghettos. They implemented rationing systems designed to starve the population into submission. They executed civilians for violations real and imagined. The optical workshop was stripped of equipment and converted into a storage facility for Wehrmacht supplies. In October 1941, partisan recruiters made contact. They needed men willing to disappear into the forests and marshes to conduct sabotage operations against German supply lines. They needed people with technical skills, with knowledge of optics and mechanics and chemistry. Dmitri volunteered immediately, not for ideology or patriotism, but for the simplest and oldest of reasons: revenge. By December 1941, he was operating in the Pinsk marshes, one of hundreds of partisan fighters, conducting guerrilla warfare against an enemy that controlled the roads and cities but couldn't control the vast wetlands that made up nearly 40% of Belorussia's territory. He discovered quickly that his childhood education had prepared him for this in unexpected ways. Understanding light meant understanding shadows. Understanding optics meant understanding concealment and observation. The same principles that focused vision through a lens could be applied to focusing fire through a rifle scope. By June 1942, Dmitri Sokolov had become what his father never imagined: a killer who used light as a weapon. The partisan war in the Pinsk marshes was unlike anything else on the Eastern Front. These weren't conventional battles with clear front lines and identifiable objectives. This was assassination and ambush, sabotage and survival, conducted in terrain that hadn't changed substantially since the Stone Age. The marshes were vast, nearly 40,000 square kilometers of wetland, swamp forest, and peat bog stretching across southern Belorussia and northern Ukraine. During spring floods, 90% of the region became impassable to vehicles. Even in summer, only local guides could navigate the maze of channels and solid ground that separated traversable paths from fatal mistakes. For the Germans, the marshes represented a strategic nightmare. Major roads and rail lines crossed the region, critical supply routes connecting Army Group Center to its rear areas. But controlling those routes meant constant patrols, constant vigilance against an enemy that appeared from nowhere, struck without warning, and vanished back into the wetlands before reinforcements could respond. For the partisans, the marshes were sanctuary and fortress. Villages hidden deep in the swamps provided food and shelter. The Germans couldn't use tanks or heavy weapons effectively. Their air superiority meant nothing when cloud cover and forest canopy concealed movement. Even their numerical advantage dissolved in terrain where a squad could march within 50 meters of an enemy position and never know it. But the Germans were learning. By mid-1942, they had adapted their tactics. Instead of large sweeping operations that got bogged down and ambushed, they began using small elite reconnaissance units. These patrols moved at night, when partisan activity was theoretically limited. They used flares and oil lanterns to navigate safely, accepting that visibility was more valuable than concealment when operating in hostile territory. The strategy was working. In May 1942 alone, German night patrols had located and destroyed 3 partisan camps, killing over 80 fighters and capturing substantial weapon stockpiles. The psychological impact was severe. Partisans began to fear darkness almost as much as they feared daylight. Soviet command responded with strict protocols. All partisan units received orders: observe and report enemy movements at night, but do not engage unless directly attacked. Conserve ammunition. Avoid revealing positions. Wait for daylight to conduct offensive operations. The orders made tactical sense. Without night vision equipment, accurate fire in darkness was nearly impossible. Engaging revealed your position to an enemy that could call down artillery or airstrikes at dawn. Better to remain hidden, to survive, to fight when conditions favored the defender. But Dmitry Sokolov watched German patrols pass within 200 meters of sleeping partisan positions, their lanterns bobbing peacefully through the darkness, knowing they were invulnerable. He watched his comrades die in night raids that command headquarters only learned about hours later, when radio contact failed to be established, and he remembered his father's workshop, where light bent according to rules that could be understood and manipulated. The idea came gradually, not a sudden inspiration but as accumulated observation. German patrols used lanterns for navigation. Those lanterns created light signatures, visible for hundreds of meters. With proper optical enhancement, those signatures could become targeting solutions. Standard rifle scopes were useless at night. They magnified available light, but when there was no light to magnify, they showed nothing. What Dmitry needed was something that could amplify minimal light sources, turning faint flames into brilliant beacons while leaving the surrounding darkness undisturbed. The solution required materials he shouldn't have and knowledge he wasn't supposed to possess. In early May 1942, Dmitry's partisan unit had ambushed a German supply convoy near the village of Petrikov. Among the destroyed vehicles was a Luftwaffe truck carrying aircraft instruments and repair equipment. Most partisans ignored this material as useless for guerrilla warfare, but Dmitry recognized opportunity. Aircraft instruments used phosphorescent paint for night visibility. Cockpit panels glowed faintly in darkness, allowing pilots to read gauges without creating light visible to enemy fighters. The paint contained radium compounds mixed with phosphorescent crystals that absorbed ambient radiation and re-emitted it as visible light. More valuable still were the instruments themselves. Optical rangefinders, gun sights, navigation equipment, all containing precisely ground glass lenses and reflective mirror assemblies. Over 3 weeks, working by candlelight in a concealed dugout, Dmitry began his experiment. He started with a captured German ZF-39 rifle scope, standard issue for Wehrmacht snipers. The scope itself was excellent, better than anything Soviet forces had produced, with crisp optics and reliable adjustments, but it was blind at night. Dmitry's modification was elegantly simple in concept, fiendishly difficult in execution. He disassembled the scope completely, then added a secondary optical path using salvaged aircraft lenses. These lenses were coated with phosphorescent material in carefully calculated patterns. When minimal light struck the coating ultraviolet fluorescence, it glowed. That glow, properly filtered and reflected through a mirror assembly, created artificial illumination within the scope itself. The effect was amplified by a small battery-powered ultraviolet light source, no larger than a cigarette lighter, mounted parallel to the scope. The UV light was invisible to human eyes, but caused the phosphorescent coating to glow more brightly. Through carefully arranged polarizing filters, also salvaged from aircraft equipment, this glow could be directed to enhance contrast. The result wasn't night vision, as modern soldiers would understand it. Dmitri hadn't created true image intensification or thermal imaging. What he had created was a light amplification system that made existing light sources, lanterns, matches, even the faint glow of a cigarette, appear dramatically brighter while leaving everything else in darkness. More importantly, the thermal variance created by those light sources, the heat signature of the human body holding a lantern, created a ghostly halo effect. Through Dmitri's modified scope, a German soldier carrying a lantern didn't just appear as a point of light. He appeared as a man-shaped silhouette limned in pale radiance, clearly defined against absolute darkness. He tested the device cautiously, first observing distant lights from the safety of his position, then tracking comrades who didn't know they were being watched. The modification worked. Not perfectly, not reliably in all conditions, but well enough to kill. He reported his innovation to the partisan commander Nikolai Vasiliev, a former Red Army captain who had escaped encirclement in 1941 and organized resistance in the marshes. Vasiliev's response was immediate and unambiguous. "Unauthorized equipment endangers the unit," Vasiliev stated flatly, examining the modified scope with undisguised suspicion. "If this device fails during an engagement, or if the Germans capture it and develop countermeasures, you've compromised our entire operational security." "It works," Dmitri insisted. "I've tested it extensively." "Against what? Static lights in controlled conditions?" Vasiliev shook his head. "You want permission to violate standing orders, reveal our position through unauthorized fire, and risk the lives of every man in this unit based on a contraption built from scrap?" "German patrols killed 23 people at the Stromoye camp last week," Dmitri replied quietly. "They walked right past observation posts that couldn't see them in darkness. This device would have prevented that, or it would have gotten the observers killed faster," Vasiliev countered. "The answer is no. You will follow standing orders. Observe and report. Do not engage after dark." Dmitri didn't argue further. But he didn't disassemble the scope either. 3 days later, German patrols began systematic operations in their sector. Intelligence reports indicated a major anti-partisan sweep was being planned. Night reconnaissance units were probing defenses, mapping positions, identifying targets for follow-up attacks. On the night of June 12th, Dmitri was assigned to observation duty with his spotter, Yakov Primakov, a former schoolteacher who had volunteered after the Germans burned his village. Their orders were explicit. Watch the eastern approach channels. Report any enemy movement. Do not engage. They took position at dusk, concealing themselves in a reed bed with excellent sight lines across nearly 600 meters of marsh. Behind them, 2 kilometers distant, 73 partisan fighters slept in concealed dugouts, trusting that observers would provide early warning of any threat. At 2200 hours, Dmitri detected movement. Through his modified scope, a faint amber glow appeared, resolving gradually into a lantern carried by the lead member of a German patrol. "Contact," he whispered to Yakov. "Southeast, approximately 400 meters. Single light source moving northwest." Yakov peered through standard binoculars and saw nothing. "Are you certain?" "I don't see anything." "They're being cautious," Dmitri murmured, tracking the nearly invisible column through his scope. The thermal enhancement was working perfectly. Through the layered lenses, he could count individual soldiers. I make it 12, no, 17 personnel. Infantry formation, carrying what looks like automatic weapons. They're moving toward the Leshnaya dugouts. The Leshnaya dugouts housed 38 partisans, including the unit's only doctor and most of their medical supplies. Yakov tried the radio, speaking softly into the handset. Command, this is observation post 7. Possible contact. Southeast sector. Request confirmation and instructions. Over. The radio crackled with static. After 30 seconds, a tired voice responded. Observation 7. Negative visibility reported from all positions. Are you certain of contact? Over. Affirmative, Yakov replied. Sokolov has visual confirmation. A pause. Then, Sokolov is using unauthorized equipment. Command does not recognize observations made with unapproved modifications. Maintain position. Do not engage. Out. Yakov set down the radio, his face invisible in darkness but his frustration obvious. They don't believe us. Dmitri continued tracking the patrol. They were 300 meters away now, moving with practiced efficiency. These weren't conscripts or rear echelon troops. These were elite reconnaissance soldiers, probably from a Jaeger division, trained specifically for anti-partisan operations in difficult terrain. And they were moving directly towards sleeping fighters who had no idea death was approaching. Command is 2 hours away by runner, Yakov said quietly. Even if they believed us and dispatched a reaction force immediately, the Germans would reach Leshnaya in 20 minutes. Dmitri made his decision. Correction. They would have reached Leshnaya in 20 minutes. Dmitri, don't. Orders are explicit. Orders are explicit for men who can't see in darkness, Dmitri countered, making minute adjustments to his scope. I can see them. Range 280 meters. Wind negligible. Temperature cold but stable. I have a perfect shot, Yakov hesitated. He was a school teacher, not a soldier. His entire military experience consisted of 6 months of partisan operations and whatever lessons survival had taught him. But he had also seen what German night patrols did to camps they caught sleeping. If you're wrong, Yakov said slowly, Vasiliev will have you shot. If I'm wrong, there won't be anyone left to shoot me. Dmitri settled into firing position, his breathing slowing, his heartbeat stabilizing. Through the modified scope, the patrol leader was clearly visible. A German Feldwebel carrying a map case and consulting it periodically by the lantern light. The man holding the lantern stood slightly behind and to the left, providing illumination without blocking the leader's view. Both were perfect targets. Dmitri exhaled halfway and squeezed the trigger. The Mosin Nagant's report shattered the marsh's silence like thunder. Through his scope, Dmitri saw the lantern-bearer collapse instantly, the light toppling into the water and extinguishing. Before the Germans could react, he worked the bolt and fired again. The patrol leader dropped. His map case falling into the darkness, chaos erupted. German soldiers dove for cover, some firing blindly toward where they thought the shots originated, others shouting orders in confusion. Several tried to light matches or flares to assess the situation. Each light source became a target. Dmitri fired methodically, not rapidly but with measured precision. Third shot, a soldier attempting to light a flare. Fourth shot, an NCO using a flashlight to check casualties. Fifth shot, someone trying to use matchlight to read a compass. The Germans realized quickly that light meant death. Orders were shouted to extinguish all illumination. Within seconds, the patrol was in complete darkness, trapped in unfamiliar terrain with no way to navigate safely, and an invisible enemy that could apparently see them perfectly. Dmitri continued firing, not at lights now, but at the thermal signatures visible through his scope. The residual heat from human bodies, enhanced by the phosphorescent coating, created faint halos against the marsh's cold background. The effect wasn't perfect, didn't work at longer ranges, but at 250 meters it was sufficient. 8th shot, 9th shot, 10th shot. Each found a target. The surviving Germans broke. Professional soldiers, well-trained and well-equipped, fled in panic from an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't locate, couldn't fight. They abandoned their dead, their equipment, their mission, splashing through the marsh in desperate retreat. Behind them, the partisan camp began to wake. Flares shot into the sky, illuminating the killing ground. Machine gun positions opened fire at the fleeing Germans, cutting down several who had survived Dmitri's shooting. Within minutes, it was over. 17 German soldiers dead or dying. The survivors scattered so completely that they wouldn't reform as an effective unit for hours. Dmitri and Yakov were already moving, abandoning their position before German artillery could zero in on their firing location. They moved quickly through familiar terrain, reaching the partisan camp, just as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Commander Vasiliev was waiting. The confrontation was immediate and public. Vasiliev stood outside the command dugout, his face exhausted but his eyes cold with fury. Around him, other partisans gathered, some curious, some concerned, all watching to see how this would resolve. "You disobeyed direct orders," Vasiliev stated without preamble. "You engaged without authorization, revealed your position, and initiated combat in violation of explicit instructions." Dmitri stood at attention, his modified rifle still slung across his shoulder. "Yes, Commander. You endangered this entire unit. If those Germans had been the advance element of a larger force, your engagement would have triggered a response that could have destroyed us." "Yes, Commander." Vasiliev stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You also saved 38 lives at Leshnaya. We intercepted German radio traffic. That patrol was the vanguard of a battalion-strength sweep operation. They were mapping our positions for an assault planned for tomorrow night. Because you scattered them, the Germans have postponed their operation. They think we have night vision capability, that we can engage them effectively in darkness." He paused, studying Dmitri's face. "Show me the scope." Dmitri unslung his rifle and carefully detached the modified scope, presenting it to the commander. Vasiliev examined it with the same suspicion he'd shown days earlier, but now there was grudging curiosity mixed with the skepticism. "Explain how it works." Dmitri did, describing the phosphorescent coating, the polarized filters, the ultraviolet light source, the thermal enhancement effect. He explained limitations, effective ranges, conditions under which it failed. He was technical, precise, avoiding embellishment or exaggeration. When he finished, Vasiliev was silent for a long moment. Finally, he looked up. "How many men did you kill tonight?" 8 confirmed. "Possibly 2 more wounded who died during the retreat." "And you could see all of them?" "Clearly enough for accurate fire. Every man who carried a light source or stood near one," Dmitri confirmed. "The thermal variance creates a visible signature through the scope. Not perfect, not at long range, but effective within 300 meters. Vasiliev looked at the scope again, then at Dmitri. "The NKVD is going to steal this or kill you for inventing it." "I know. And if I report this to command, they'll either want you transferred to a technical unit or shot for unauthorized innovation." Vasiliev handed the scope back. "Fortunately, radio communication with command is currently disrupted. It may take several days before I can file a complete report on tonight's engagement." Dmitri understood. "What do you need from me?" "Documentation. Complete schematics, materials list, assembly instructions. If this works as well as you claim, other units need it. The Germans are winning the night war. This might change that." Vasiliev gestured toward the command dugout. "But first you need to train others. I want 3 more scopes operational within 2 weeks. And I want you to train 6 snipers to use them effectively." "And the orders? About engaging at night?" Vasiliev smiled thinly. "Orders are written for normal circumstances. This is no longer a normal circumstance. You have authorization to engage at your discretion, when you can achieve kills without compromising unit security. Use it wisely." Over the next month, Dmitri's innovation spread through the partisan network like fire through dry grass. He trained 6 snipers, each receiving a modified scope built to his specifications. Materials were scrounged from captured equipment, salvaged aircraft, even broken eyeglasses donated by sympathetic civilians. The scopes weren't identical. Each was slightly different, adapted to individual shooters and available materials. But they all worked on the same principle, amplifying faint light sources and thermal variants to create visibility where none should exist. The results were dramatic. German night casualties in the Pinsk marshes increased by over 300% in July 1942. More importantly, German operational doctrine began to change. Night patrols became smaller, more cautious. The use of lanterns and flares declined sharply. Reconnaissance operations that had been routine became hazardous. By August, intercepted German communications revealed genuine fear. "Enemy possesses unknown night vision capability," one report stated. "Casualties during darkness operations unsustainable. Recommends suspension of night reconnaissance, pending development of countermeasures." The German High Command concluded that Soviet forces must have deployed experimental infrared detection equipment, technology both sides were researching, but hadn't yet fielded effectively. The truth, that a former optician's son had improvised a solution using salvaged materials, seemed too improbable to consider. The psychological impact was profound. German forces began to fear darkness in the marshes, conceding night operations to an enemy they could no longer see or predict. This didn't end anti-partisan operations. The Germans remained dominant in daylight, but it eliminated their ability to conduct the systematic night sweeps that had been so devastatingly effective. Soviet intelligence noticed. By September 1942, NKVD technical officers arrived in the marshes, demanding to examine the ghost lens that partisan reports mentioned. Dmitri was questioned extensively about his innovation, about where he learned optical engineering, about whether he had received outside assistance. The questions weren't curious. They were accusatory. Soviet security services were chronically paranoid about unauthorized innovation, seeing potential sabotage or foreign influence in anything that deviated from approved procedures. Dmitri provided complete documentation, answered every question honestly, and waited to see whether he would be rewarded or arrested. In Stalin's Soviet Union, both outcomes were equally plausible. In the end, he was neither rewarded nor arrested. His design was classified, copied, and officially attributed to Soviet technical research initiatives. The modified scopes were distributed to select partisan units with no acknowledgement of their origin. Dmitri received a commendation for exceptional service to the partisan movement, which meant exactly nothing and changed nothing. He continued fighting, continued killing, continued using light as a weapon against men who made the mistake of believing darkness was their ally. By the time Soviet forces liberated Belorussia in 1944, Dmitri had 47 confirmed kills using his modified scope. 47 men who died because they carried lanterns, lit cigarettes, checked maps by flashlight. 47 men whose last sight was muzzle flash from a weapon they never saw. Fired by a man they couldn't have known existed. The number haunted him more than he expected. The war ended on May 9, 1945. Dmitri Sokolov survived, which was more than most partisan fighters could say. He returned to Minsk in June, carrying his rifle and the modified scope that had made him legendary among men who would never speak of what they'd done in the marshes. His father's workshop was gone. Not damaged, not ransacked, simply gone. The building had been demolished during the German occupation, replaced with a concrete structure housing Soviet administrative offices. No record existed of Viktor Sokolov's fate. No grave, no official notification, nothing. He had simply vanished into the machinery of war. one of tens of millions who died without ceremony or acknowledgement. Dmitri didn't stay in Minsk. The city was full of ghosts, memories of a world that no longer existed and couldn't be recovered. He moved to Leningrad, where reconstruction efforts needed skilled workers, and no one asked too many questions about wartime service. In 1947, Soviet optical engineers contacted him. They were developing military night vision equipment based on captured German research, and wanted to interview veterans who had field experience with improvised systems. They knew about the ghost lens, knew he had created it, wanted to incorporate his innovations into official programs. Dmitri refused. Not angrily, not dramatically, simply refused. He had no interest in helping create better tools for killing, no desire to see his father's lessons about light and precision transformed into industrial-scale weapons development. The engineers were persistent, then frustrated, finally threatening. Refusal to assist state military research could be construed as anti-Soviet activity. He was reminded of his obligation to serve the motherland, of the privileges he enjoyed as a war veteran, of the consequences of non-cooperation. Dmitri listened politely and continued refusing. Eventually, the engineers gave up. He wasn't important enough to arrest, and his innovation had already been documented and replicated. They didn't need his cooperation, just his knowledge, and they already had that. He opened a small lens-grinding shop on Vasilyevsky Island, a modest operation serving civilians who needed eyeglasses, opticians who needed custom components, photographers who needed specialized filters. The work was familiar, almost meditative, grinding glass with the same patient precision his father had taught him decades earlier. He married in 1949 a fair widow named Svetlana, who had lost her husband at the Leningrad blockade. They had 2 children, a daughter in 1950 and a son in 1953. He never spoke to them about the war, never mentioned the marshes, or the ghost lens, or the 47 men who died, because he made darkness afraid of light. The modifications he had created influenced post-war research more than anyone publicly acknowledged. Soviet first-generation night vision devices, deployed in the 1950s, incorporated principles Dmitri had discovered through improvisation. Western intelligence eventually learned about the Pinsk innovation, as it was called in classified documents. Though details remained murky for decades, Dmitri lived quietly, grinding lenses, raising children, aging into a man who looked like any other Soviet pensioner. He maintained his optical workshop even after retirement, finding comfort in the familiar work, the precision required, the way light bent according to rules that could be understood and controlled. In 1983, his grandson Pavel, then 16 years old, discovered an old photograph while helping clean the workshop. The photo showed young men in partisan uniforms standing in front of camouflage dugouts. One of them, barely recognizable, was his grandfather. "Dedushka," Pavel asked, holding up the photo, "is this you? In the war?" Dmitri glanced at the photo, seeing ghosts. "Yes. Were you really a sniper?" "Mama said you were, but she didn't know details." "I was." Pavel hesitated, then asked the question that had probably been building for years. "Did you really kill men in the dark?" The boys at school say there are stories about a partisan who could see at night who killed dozens of Germans. They say it was you. Dmitri set down the lens he had been grinding and looked at his grandson. The boy was earnest, curious, old enough to deserve honesty, but young enough that honesty might harm him. "I made darkness afraid of light," Dmitri said finally. "That's all war ever is. Making your enemy fear something they shouldn't have to fear. Making them die for reasons they probably didn't understand. I did that. I was good at it. And when it was over, I came home and tried to forget I had ever been good at killing." "But you saved people," Pavel insisted. "That's what the stories say. You saved partisan camps, stopped German attacks." "I saved some people by killing other people," Dmitri corrected gently. That's not heroism. That's just survival. The men I killed probably had families, probably had good reasons for being where they were. They were just following orders, just doing what their commanders told them to do. And I killed them because I could see them when they thought they were invisible. He picked up a finished lens, holding it up to catch the golden afternoon light streaming through the workshop window. This is what your great-grandfather taught me. That light follows rules, that understanding those rules gives you power. He meant power to help people see more clearly, to correct vision, to make the world less blurry. I used those same rules to kill. I'm not proud of that. I'm not ashamed exactly, because I did what survival required. But I'm not proud. Pavel was quiet for a moment, processing this. Finally he asked, "Would you do it again, if you had to?" Dmitri considered the question carefully. If circumstances were identical, if the choice was between killing and watching innocent people die, yes, I'd do it again. That doesn't make it right. It just makes it necessary. And necessity is a terrible justification for anything. But sometimes it's the only one we have. He set the lens down and looked at his grandson. The real question isn't whether I'd do it again. The real question is why the world keeps creating circumstances where such choices become necessary. That's what you should think about. Not whether individuals make the right choices in impossible situations, but why we keep building impossible situations. Pavel didn't fully understand. How could he? He had grown up in a world where war was stories told by old men, not immediate reality. But he nodded, sensing the weight of what his grandfather was trying to communicate. Dmitri Sokolov died in his sleep on November 3rd, 1988, 3 years before the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. His obituary in the Leningrad newspaper mentioned his optical shop, his family, his wartime service in generic terms. There was no mention of the ghost lens, no acknowledgement of the innovation that had changed partisan warfare in the Pinsk marshes. His workshop was sold, his tools distributed among family members. The modified rifle scope, which he had kept all those years, was donated to a military museum, where it sat in storage for decades, unlabeled and unexplained. It wasn't until 2008, 20 years after his death, that a Russian military historian researching partisan operations discovered references to the ghost lens in declassified NKVD files. The historian Anatoly Volkov spent 3 years tracking down surviving partisans, interviewing families, piecing together the story of how one man's understanding of light had created a weapon that terrified an army. Volkov's book, Invisible Weapons, Innovation and Improvisation in the Great Patriotic War, dedicated an entire chapter to Dmitri Sokolov. Using declassified documents, surviving technical drawings, and interviews with optical engineers who had examined the original scope, Volkov reconstructed both the technical achievement and the moral complexity of what Dmitri had created. The book revealed something most historians had missed. German casualties from partisan night operations in the Pinsk marshes dropped dramatically after August 1942, not because the ghost lens stopped working, but because German forces simply stopped conducting night patrols in partisan-controlled territory. An entire tactical doctrine was abandoned because of one man's innovation. More significantly, Volkov discovered that several Soviet optical engineers who pioneered first-generation night vision technology in the 1950s had specifically studied Dmitri's work. Though never officially credited, the ghost lens had directly influenced military research that eventually produced the equipment used by Soviet forces for decades. The Kato connection had been classified for years because acknowledging that sophisticated military technology originated from improvised partisan equipment was embarrassing to Soviet military leadership. Better to pretend that centralized research had produced these innovations through proper scientific methodology. Volkov's book sparked renewed interest in World War II innovation, particularly the role of improvised weapons and tactics developed by soldiers who couldn't afford to wait for official solutions. Dmitri's story became a case study in military academies, discussed alongside Thomas Randall's night vision modifications in the Battle of the Bulge, as examples of how frontline necessity drives innovation faster than institutional research. In 2015, the Russian Ministry of Defense officially recognized Dmitry Sokolov's contribution to military optical technology. A small plaque was installed at the site of his Leningrad workshop, now long converted to other purposes, commemorating his wartime service and technical innovation. His grandson Pavel attended the ceremony, now an old man himself. In interviews afterward, he repeated what his grandfather had told him decades earlier. He made darkness afraid of light. That's all war ever is. The Pinsk marshes are quiet now. The dugouts have collapsed, reclaimed by the wetland that hides history as effectively as it once hid partisans. The channels where German patrols once moved with lanterns are still there, navigated now by fishermen and birdwatchers who have no idea what happened in those waters 70 years ago. But in military museums and classified research archives, in case studies and engineering textbooks, the ghost lens endures, not as a weapon but as a lesson. That sometimes the courage to see differently, to trust knowledge that others dismiss, to act when institutions demand passivity, can change the course of history. Dmitry Sokolov never wanted to be remembered as a warrior or an innovator. He wanted to be remembered, if at all, as an optician's son who learned that light bends for those who understand it, that precision and patience can solve problems, that seeing clearly matters more than seeing what you're expected to see. Some men are haunted by what they saw in war. Dmitry Sokolov was haunted by what he made others see, the last light they'd ever mistake for safety.